Let's do it.
Of course. All right. Porthos, Aramis, Athos, we're together again. It's nice to see y'all. We're going to begin. We're going to do two things quickly, and then we're going to spend most of our time talking about Russia and Ukraine. But Marco wants to talk about Comrade Mamdani and his visit with Comrade Trump or hair leader Trump. I don't know what we should call him. I assume, Marco, that you saw Trump is now dressing up in long black flowing trench coats with scarves after having met Mamdani. If you were living under a rock, Mamdani and Trump had a meeting. They were extremely friendly with each other afterwards. Mamdani was asked in front of Trump whether he held to his previous statement that Trump was a fascist, and before Mamdani could answer, Trump said, "Just tell them yes, that's fine. It's simpler than explaining it." And gave him a nice little pat on the side. We should all have somebody who looks at us the way that Donald Trump looks at the comrade. So, Marco, please cook. What do you want to talk about here?
Well, first of all, I also want to say welcome to our third musketeer, Matt Gertken. Long time, of course. We've all worked together for now almost, I mean, throughout the last 2 decades. So for longer than I think we're willing to admit, given that we're now getting old. But Matt, good to have you on our pod as the
Yeah,
third cousin.
it's great to be with you guys as always.
So let's dive into it. Look, I think what was really interesting about this is it was extremely friendly. I wasn't that surprised. Trump likes winners. He's impressed by winners. So anyone who's accomplished anything in life, Trump is like, I like that. And for all the Cuomo criticism that Mamdani's never had a job in his life, the truth is he did crush him. So that matters. The second thing is, and this is where I would love to have Matt's thoughts on this. What I thought was actually significant from President Trump's signaling, his behavior, his body language, the tone of his voice, the soft touch of Mamdani's forearm, all those little nuances. What I get from that is that, he's looking at the lay of the land. Inflation, affordability are the number one thing. He's got his former advisor and one-time campaign chief, Stephen Bannon, who's been calling for higher taxes on the wealthy for now years. I mean, I think there's very little daylight between AOC and Stephen Bannon, for example, on taxation. And I wonder if we saw the first or perhaps a significant pivot on at least macroeconomic policy by the Republican Party, by the MAGA camp, maybe just by President Trump. But that's something that I would flag, that I think that there are two ways to interpret this. One is just Trump likes winners. Mamdani crushed it. Like, he deserves respect in sort of Trump's, kind of like just medieval Bronze Age world. Like, he's a conqueror and he deserves respect. On the other hand, I wonder if there's also some nuanced politics going on. Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. Definitely Trump is really good at, collaborating and co-opting any threats or perceived threats. So I think there's part of that because there's this really superficial or commercial aspect, which is sort of like if Mamdani is the new big thing, then why spend a bunch of time being grumpy and sort of resisting it or pretending that it's not happening? Why not just get out in front of it and make him part of the Trump fan club, which is what those pictures look like because Mamdani's kind of beaming, to be in the Oval Office. But I don't know. I guess if there's deep planning behind it, it might simply be that it's convenient for Trump and the Republicans if they can cast the Democrats as all socialists in the midterm election. And so elevating Mamdani's importance, beyond 50% of New York to the idea that he represents the entire Democratic Party, that seems that it could be a useful ploy. Uh, but in terms of fiscal policy, yeah, eventually Republicans are going to have to accommodate themselves to some revenue raising, and in a way, that's what Trump represents by using tariffs as a tool. Um, but I'm not sure that they, as a party, have anywhere near the type of, like for example, Bannon made what I think you were referring to, Marco. Bannon made a really simple suggestion, which was to raise the highest income tax rate back to where it was under President Obama, and Republicans as a party weren't willing to do that.
I mean, ideology is just a circle. So if you go far enough down the left and far enough down the right, you will eventually meet each other. And I sort of thought that was, to me, that would encapsulate what happened in that meeting, because Trump has gone far enough down the right and Mamdani has gone far enough down the left that they're just meeting there, and they're having a party. Marco, I've been using your slide about the approval ratings for Trump on the economy versus Biden. And I don't know if you saw this. I mean, when Biden left office, it was his approval rating on the economy was 37%, and Trump had been hanging out around 45. The latest ABC Washington Post Ipsos poll had President Trump at 37%. That's his approval rating on the economy right now, which is where Biden was when he left. So I think there might be something there. Also, Matt, to your point about Mamdani beaming, it's funny. I wish I remembered what the account was, but I saw this great social media person, South Asian social media personality, say everybody who is in this, who is sort of, is quote unquote brown, makes this face when they're dealing with a white person who is talking to them about things that they don't know about, this like fake little smile to try and placate them. And I thought that was actually a pretty cutting remark too. I don't know. I think it's pretty strange. Marco, when you say it's a pivot in fiscal policy, do you mean raising taxes, or you mean that actually Trump is going to open up the goodies and start giving out handouts and things like that? Or do you mean both?
Well, I purposely use the term macroeconomic policy because I just mean like broadly defined. Adopting more and more things from the left, because President Trump is kind of a chameleon. He has done a lot of things that you wouldn't have expected a Republican president to do, such as, I don't know, like being anti-free trade. That used to be more of a Democratic Party domain. As Matt pointed out, I mean, he did kind of raise taxes already on consumption. But one of the things that he has been pretty steadfast and pretty traditional Republican, his greatest legislative achievement of his two terms is the 2017 tax cut, which was, Paul Ryan like passed that and was like, I'm out, and he opened up his umbrella and went back to, the land of like Hayek and Ronald Reagan. And he's never been seen from again. Paul Ryan's just like, my job here is done. So if you actually look at the Jobs and Tax Cut Act, Tax Cut Act of 2017, I mean, it is traditional, just Republican policy. And so that's what I mean, Jacob, broadly defined macroeconomic policy.
Yeah.
Moving a little bit more to the left and seeking to counter some, like when Mamdani said, hey, we had a good meeting, we agree on affordability. Well, for example, like, childcare, like free childcare. I mean, did you guys agree on that? Because that would be a pretty big departure of the Republican agenda. And so I wonder if that, like maybe there will be some ways to look at, expanding the welfare state and financing it by taxing people more. Like I literally mean that,
Well, a good test case, the Republicans, to end the government shutdown, had to promise that they would hold a vote on extending those Obamacare subsidies that had been expanded during COVID. And they do technically owe the Democrats a vote, and they would kind of undershoot their own claim to be winning working class voters if they just nix those subsidies. So we might just in a month or two see a test case of whether the Republicans can actually extend those subsidies just for a year past the midterm as some kind of bribe to prevent voters from being too unhappy with it. Because the issue is, if healthcare premiums are going up anyway, then everyone can blame them if they don't extend the subsidies. Whereas if they extend the subsidies, there won't be as big of an increase in premiums, and they get to say that they did something. They could even maybe rebrand it as, instead of expanded Obamacare subsidies, they could call them Trump Care subsidies or whatever.
But just to be clear, all I'm saying is Trump, right? Trump may be creating an exit for himself. It may fail because, as Matt points out, like, Senator Thune like does not strike me as a dude who would have softly touched Mamdani's arm and said, "Call me whatever you want, son. I'm okay with that."
Well, it could succeed spectacularly if Democrats take both houses and Trump is forced to endorse some of their policies in legislation in 2027.
And if you don't like that, you don't like NBA basketball. Let me tell you that right now.
Yeah. Well, here I'll close this out on this. I actually wasn't that like. I feel like a lot of folks in New York City are scared of Mamdani. There's been a fear thing around Mamdani, and I have to say I've never been more scared of him as a politician than with the ruthless pragmatism that he just showed. That he was willing to walk into the White House with the fascist and rub shoulders with him and talk to him. That tells me that we're actually dealing with a much more serious political operator who might actually be able to get things done versus the guy who was quoting Eugene Debs in the victory speech. That guy is not going to get anything done, but this guy could actually get some things done.
Yeah.
The second thing is to Matt's point about Trump trying to elevate him to make the next race about socialism. I think it also maybe serves to discredit Mamdani with his base too, because we've gone
Yes.
from all of the social media about, with the song that went viral and things like that. He's the leader. He's gonna put things back together, affordability, everything else, and then he's hanging out with Donald Trump, and he's going on all the shows and talking about how he's hanging out with Donald Trump, and he's offering the old police commissioner the job and like moderating himself in all these ways. And I just think the last thing is, I really mean the thing about ideology being a flat circle. Like, it's perfect. Like, Mamdani and Trump have way more in common than the political middle in the United States has. And the worse the economy gets, I think the bigger that opportunity is there in the middle, which, to your point about the Obamacare subsidies, none other than Representative Massey, who earned some of Trump's ire recently, was out there saying, this is Republican economics. We're just going to push, like, continuing to do this with Obamacare. So I think the moderates are starting to look at Trump's approval ratings, what he's doing with Mamdani, how it's all going to his head. The Bannon folks and the AOC folks basically saying the same thing, except with different, language, and saying maybe there's a big opportunity there. But, maybe hope springs eternal. Anything else you guys want to hit here before we move on?
Well, just last thing I would want to say is don't forget Mamdani's rise to prominence was asking Trump voters why they voted for Trump. Like, that was the first TikTok video he did was that. And so, yes, you're right, Jacob. I do think his supporters will start to accuse him of platforming, which is this accusation on the left that if you hold a conversation with somebody who is like, flirts with fascism, you're giving them a platform and therefore you are, I don't know, triggering people and causing them anxiety, which is like, life. But what I would say is that in this case, like, let's not forget, Mamdani rose to prominence based on doing exactly what he did in the White House, which is like sitting down and with a smile on his face saying like, all right, well, like, we got to live together. So let's figure it out. And I think, we should, whether you agree with his politics or not, I think that's what Western civilization is about. So, well done, Mamdani.
Yeah. All
And I
about
guess Trump.
soft handshakes between comrades and Führers. Okay, comrades and Führers. There's a podcast
That's our
title right
title.
there.
Yes.
All right, let's move on to Japan and China. It took me a while to find the actual quote, but so Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, she was speaking during a parliamentary session when she was asked about a scenario involving a Chinese military action against Taiwan. Here's her quote. Quote, if warships are used accompanied by the exercise of military force, then, however you look at it, it could be a situation posing an existential threat to the country. And then she went on, to say that it might involve Japan using military force as a result of that existential threat. China has reacted to that by saying it was shocking, that it was a grave violation of international law, there was another one I had here, entirely unacceptable. Matt, I'm sure you're going to tell us about the head and the snake metaphor here too. It's caused a rather large spat in Japanese-Chinese relations. We've had everything from economic reprisals like travel warnings and cancellations of Japanese movie premieres, and even threats over specific classes of Japanese products into China, and then backwards and forwards. So, I think this is actually something that we've slept on a little bit. But Matt, lead us up to it and tell us what's going on with this Japan-China spat.
Yeah, it'll probably be a pretty big quarrel when all's said and done. I've been for the guesswork that you can do on this kind of thing several months. They're going to be clashing pretty hard. It could extend well into next year. And China just today is starting to actually interfere with airline passage to Japan. Initially, they were just discouraging tourists from going to Japan. Now they might actually be shutting down flights. So it'll escalate. It is true that they're targeting, seafood and initially discouraging tourists. Well, those are not the worst ramifications. There could eventually be a total tourist shutdown. There could be rare earth embargo like they did in 2010 against Japan. But one of my colleagues, Jesse Curry, has made a great point, which is that China still needs semiconductor equipment from Japan, so they're not going to completely cut off their trade. But it fits within a long story. Every few years, these two end up having a bit of a trade clash and nationalist protests and these things. I think it does make sense from Japan's strategic point of view that they would need to defend Taiwan, and if it were attacked, which is of course a hypothetical, but if it were, they would probably need to for their own supply security. It would fit with their own sort of grand strategy over history to do that. So she was stating what actually I've said for many years, and I'm sure many people that look at Japan have said, but it's different when the prime minister says it than anybody else. I think it's not irrelevant here that she's the first woman prime minister of Japan, so she probably wanted to come out with a very stark sort of Elizabethan national security policy and basically make sure that nobody's going to try to take advantage of her. And I think she probably feels insecure because President Trump has negotiated a trade truce with China. And he at least initially acted as if Taiwan would be on the table when he went to Busan, South Korea to meet with Xi Jinping. And I think his advisors quickly told him, "Well, no, we're not trading Taiwan for soybeans. That wouldn't really be a great trade from an American national interest perspective." And so Taiwan kind of fell off of the menu. But we know something's going on because Xi Jinping then called Donald Trump and they talked about Taiwan. And then he immediately afterwards called Takaichi to inform her of what Xi Jinping said. So there's some sort of back channel and behind the curtain negotiation about Taiwan right now. And I think the obvious point here is that Japan has a moment where they can step forward and say, well, look, they're doing what the U.S. demands, which is that an ally picks up a larger share of the burden. They're increasing the deterrence around Taiwan. But they're also sort of in a tough situation because Trump doesn't want to ruin his own trade truce for Japan's sake. So that means that now they're now engaged in a one-on-one, at least a miniature trade war with China.
Can I ask some questions, Matt?
Sure, go for it.
I guess that's why you're here. So you have to say yes. First, can you can you explain for our audience, like, beyond just the semiconductors, right? Taiwan produces whatever percent of global semiconductors. It's a lot. Aside from that, you mentioned that there's like a geopolitical imperative for Japan to care about Taiwan. Can you explain a little bit about that? Like,
Yeah.
what does that mean and what does it look like?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's fair to say, based on their history, they're always resource poor. They have to import their food and fuel. That's still the case today. They heavily depend on imports, especially energy, and those imports almost by definition have to go, from the Middle East through the Strait of Malacca and then up through the Taiwan Strait or around Taiwan. Obviously, the Western Pacific is really big, so you can of course move your supply line into the Pacific if you want to avoid the Taiwan Strait. But if China had the capability to conquer the island, then they would also have the capability to interfere with Japan's supply line. So that would be a traditional a strategic threat to them, and it's one that they're very sensitive to, and one of the reasons why they fought China in the past, and in the 1890s and early 1900s strove to gain control of Taiwan. So it's an island in their own island chain, and China views it as sort of China views that island chain from Japan down to the Philippines and in Southeast Asia as sort of a containment that they need to break out of, and Japan views it as a strategic approach. When we can think of like the Americans island hopping and taking Osaka and then being able to run bomb raids into Japan. So it's just it's an unfortunate turf war that's reawakening, and of course these two have the most ancient antagonism, partly for those reasons. So it does what she's saying fits with probably what their strategic planners are saying, which is that it's just not in Japan's interest to let China take Taiwan by force.
How would you gauge if we would have like a 0 to 10, on China's reaction? And not just based on its previous reactions to comments like this, but also how you would have thought they would have reacted. Do you
Yeah.
feel that China has reacted, from 0 to 10, like 10 out of 10 being like declaration of war, zero, like, sure, whatever, invade us? Like, where would you put this?
Yeah, yeah. They've kind of, so as a state, they've kind of underreacted.
Hmm,
But their
interesting.
reaction, but we should acknowledge that their reaction is still building. That this is an emerging crisis between the two, or an emerging trade spat, and so they are ramping up their response. But I'd say right now they're going from like a, they're going from like a 4 to a 5. They're not
Well,
they're not moving up into 7, 8 type territory. And I would say that when it first happened, the Osaka consul general's comment that he would cut off Takaichi's head, that was a huge shock. That was like wolf. That was like Wolf Warrior times 10, and everyone was like, "Whoa!" But the thing is that Beijing, he had to take that post down, and Beijing's response is a little bit different than what he
but
said.
okay, so first of all, I think Jacob and I definitely support policymakers threatening to cut off each other's heads. I just want to say that, like, that's just a layup for us. Thank you
I
guys.
mean, it
This
definitely, yeah, it helps business. Thank you. Keep threatening. It's good.
yeah, I mean, like, we got
Job
Matt
security.
Todd. I mean, this is like a layup. Like, I didn't even say it, and it's my job to say stuff like that. But the second thing is, it's interesting what you just said. You said the Chinese state is, relatively calm on this. I think there is a narrative out there that they're preparing to, like, invade Taiwan. I think something like this, in a context of preparing to invade Taiwan, is a great opportunity to start laying the groundwork for that. They're behaving quite rationally. Beijing is, and almost conciliatory in a way. But the other thing I wanted to ask you is, what about sentiment on the ground? Because in the past, of course, there were like boycotts of, Hondas and Toyotas. There was, I think, violence even,
Hmm.
by just protesters, where China a couple of times thought it went out of hand, had to kind of dampen those protests. What about the civil society in China? I mean, I feel like this statement has not really irked anyone in China. It's almost like they don't really care. The cutting of the head was like, what? But that was them to Japan. Like, they're, I don't know. What do you agree? Do you think I'm reading
Yeah,
too much
I
into it?
do. The only thing is that my again best guess on how this episode is going to play out. I think there probably will be quite a bit of escalation. Like in the end, there probably will be pretty significant like impact on quarterly exports from China
Mhm.
to Japan and Japan to China, and probably there will be nationalist protests on both sides. That's my best guess. That this will ramp up quite a bit, and there will be some scenery like you're referring to in the 2010s. You know,
Yeah.
boycotts of Japanese cars. And the thing is, this is easy now because, of course, Chinese EVs have been stealing market share anyway.
Yeah.
In the past, they'd had to switch to South Korean cars, and then they'd boycott South Korea for the terminal high altitude area defense missile and thing, and then they'd go back to buying Japanese, and they'd sort of. So this is, I mean, it's obvious that China still plays its domestic market against other countries as a major weapon, and it's quite clear that China has some latent social unrest that could be unleashed here if they want it to. So I guess maybe that would be my point here, is that if we don't see large scale anti-Japanese protests in multiple Chinese cities, then that means that the Communist Party didn't want them to happen, didn't want to play up the issue.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so you don't think they were organic in the past?
Uh, I mean, some kind of mix, but generally, I think there's
Mhm.
there's a local authority that would tend to allow a protest to happen, and I think Japan is one area where you could kind of have consensus. If among the provinces of China, if there's one topic where they're sort of willing to let people vent some social steam, that would be it. But my sense is that Communist Party, at least tacitly, allows these things.
Yeah, but before we leave this, Matt, I wanted to ask you two questions too. The first, and I think you sort of said this, but I wanted to underscore it. Do you think that what Taiki said was intentional? Because I read her comments in the context of it, and I thought if I was putting myself in her shoes, I would have thought that was a fairly innocuous statement. It felt like China was pouncing on any little thing it could to make a big deal out of it. So I wonder if you really think it was intentional, or if it was sort of just something she said and China wanted to pounce on it. And then the second thing I wanted to ask you is, what is China's objective here? Because I've seen quite a lot of speculation that China realizes that Takaichi doesn't have a majority, that she's fairly weak domestically, and if they can cause economic pain around this, maybe they can push her to the exit, and they don't want some kind of far-right nationalist who's in power here. You also juxtapose it with, her mentor, Shinzo Abe, who threaded the needle well here. He was able to have very good relations with Xi Jinping and yet hold these views at the same time, and he didn't run afoul of China in quite the same way. And I wanted to ask about intentions, because the last time this happened in 2012, it blew up in China's face. The exact thing happened that always happens with China when it overreacts, which is that everybody freaks out and starts making contingency plans to not worry about China. Like in 2012, it was the rare earths thing, where Japan starts spinning up its own capacity and not relying on China anymore. Or in 1995, where China reacts very negatively to things happening in Taiwan, and it just increases popular support on Taiwan for exactly the opposite of what the Chinese are pushing for. So I don't know, like, is there a point at which China would be like, yes, we've achieved our objective? Or do you think they just want to play it out? I can't see why China's pouncing on it so much, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, they're good points. As far as I can tell, this is one of those confluence of factors. This is one reason why I think it will escalate and it will get worse. So if China's reaction so far is like a 4 or a 5, it might be moving up in the coming months. And then Japan also, by the way, hasn't really taken trade responses, but they might be forced to do that eventually as China escalates. So I think it was completely intentional, not only because she's the first woman prime minister, but more importantly, well, there's some real interesting nuances to this. Like, so for example, one of the sources of grievance in Japan in recent politics has been too much tourism, and
Yeah.
that bubbled up during the election campaign. And the Liberal Democrats, they've now lost both houses of parliament, which, as you guys know, is very rare. The last time that happened was 29 to 2012. And then prior to that, it was 1992, 93 for a very short period. And prior to that, it was in the 1950s. So it's very rare for the Liberal Democrats not to be in complete control of the country. Their party is nervous. They have this takeover prime minister who doesn't have a personal mandate, doesn't have a majority. Even becoming prime minister, she didn't actually get a majority of the lower house vote. She just got a plurality. So she's very weak. But the one thing she has going for her, and the one thing that the LDP can probably crank up, is some nationalism. And remember that they had a pacifist Buddhist party, Komeito, that was their partner, and Komeito dropped off. And now what they have is a more far right, you could say populist or anti-establishment party, the Japanese Innovation Party, as their coalition partner. And so, in other words, you now have a little bit more of a national security oriented LDP. They don't have their pacifist coalition partner. They do need to ramp up some support, and they happen to want to reduce tourism. And the biggest bulge in tourism was Chinese people traveling to Japan after the removal of zero COVID. So, in effect, what she did was just pop the Chinese tourism bubble. And it's interesting. It has a negative effect on their economy, but it might actually help to reduce some of the grievances, and it might actually generate a little bit of support for her administration, which otherwise doesn't have a great base of popular support. Now, just real quick, on the flip side, though, I do think you're right that China pounced on this as well. So again, it was a sort of confluence of incidents, because from China's perspective, it was meaningful that they said that they would defend Japan. It does sort of raise the deterrence bar. I'm sure, I haven't checked, but I'm sure it's not the first time the statement's ever been made. But it is a significant act of or statement of deterrence. And China also wants to lean on the allies, as the United States is basically, Trump administration is taking a very transactional approach, negotiating with China, and this creates an opening. And it's actually somewhat similar to the way that Russia is meddling with, airspace of NATO countries or sabotaging railroads in Poland. There's this effect where Trump is raising the U.S. as a great power, negotiating bilaterally with Russia and China, and effectively declaring spheres of influence and tacitly giving them or implying that he might give them the sphere of influence in Ukraine and Taiwan. He's declaring his own in Venezuela. And as he plays this big power sphere of influence game, it's the allies that kind of get the shaft. And then his interlocutors, like Russia, China, they get to actually push the envelope a little bit in dealing with small neighbors that are allied with the U.S.
Yeah. Well, just wait till she visits Yasukuni Shrine, and then we'll really get some
Yeah,
fireworks because
yeah,
I expect she will.
she probably will.
Okay,
She probably will.
let's turn to Russia Ukraine, which I think actually dovetails with all of this. I'm not going to be able to do it all justice because if I recapped everything that happened in the last week, we'd be here for 15 minutes, and people don't want to hear me recap things. But let's just do the Cliff Notes version. So there's this Trump administration 28-point Ukraine peace plan. Unclear whether is this Russian demands that got sort of put in the Trump administration's mouth. Marco Rubio described it as a living document, so it was just like this is where we're starting the conversation, whatever. The Ukrainians said it was unacceptable, but came back and they have a 19-point plan, and they say they're very close on some kind of deal, but that Zelensky needs to speak to President Trump as quickly as possible to do some one-on-one negotiations, even over the Thanksgiving holiday. So there's that. I love this. The Europeans put out their response to the plan a couple of days ago. Not clear to me that anybody's read it beyond Britain, France, and Germany, but they've put out their own response to the plan as well. And then I think most interesting in all this is that alongside this 28-point plan or the 19-point plan or everything else that is going on is also a separate proposal that President Trump has given to Ukraine that apparently includes a security guarantee which is modeled on NATO's Article 5. So the 28-point plan and also basically the 19-point plan say that Ukraine's not going to be in NATO. That's a foregone conclusion. But this separate proposal says that any future attack by Russia on Ukraine will be seen as an attack on the transatlantic community, and that the US and its allies would respond accordingly. And it's unclear whether Vladimir Putin has seen this one, whether he would agree to this one, anything else. We've been here before a couple times now where the Trump administration says it has a plan, peace is nigh, and they're really just talking to themselves. It seems like Zelensky has figured out how to play this situation a little bit better. Russia, I don't know what Russia's doing. I think if you look at the plan, all the plans imply that Russia gets Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, and then the line of control wherever it is today in Zaporizhia and Kherson. So some significant territorial concessions above just Donetsk and Luhansk, but reflecting the battlefield today. I don't know. Where do you guys want to start with this? Because I look at it and I see much ado about nothing, because of course Ukraine wants it to seem like it's being cooperative. It learned earlier this year what it looks like if it doesn't look cooperative. It doesn't seem to me that anything that's being talked about is something that Russia will agree to, especially if that separate proposal on security guarantees is part of the package. And the Europeans just seem to be talking to themselves, which is always the case. So where are you guys at? Do you think this is more important? Am I guilty of dismissing it just because it's our fourth time around so far this year?
I disagree on everything you said.
Great. That's why you're here. And maybe Matt will thread the difference, or he'll tell me that I'm also an idiot. That's great. Let's go.
I think it's significant just because I think Russia would be insane not to take up this deal. I mean, the Trump administration puts forward a proposal that includes, like, at least in the original 28 points, I'm sure they're going to tone this down, but they were talking about not only would Ukraine not join NATO, but there would be no further NATO enlargement. Now, like, that's just obviously the U.S. doesn't really have a lot of immediate prospects for NATO enlargement, but still it would just be an amazing own goal to just openly declare that for no reason, just throw that in there. But also, reintegrate Russia into the global economy. That was one of the provisions. And it was effectively suggesting not only sanction relief for the oil company sanctions on Russia that went into effect this year, but implicitly all the sanctions since 2022. And there were very close restrictions on Ukraine's army. Those have now been the limit on the size of Ukraine's army has now been raised a little bit. But anyway, if you can imagine a situation where Russia gets the additional part of Donetsk that they've been fighting over, they get a permanent non-nuclear Ukraine that's not a part of NATO. There's no further NATO enlargement, and they get the sanctions removed. I mean, this is just such a victory diplomatically that you would think that the Putin administration would want to take it up. And then if you have Trump and Putin agree, I think it actually, with some exceptions on the margins, I think that would be the end deal, because those two can obviously force anything on Ukraine. But I also think the Europeans would basically need to sort of acquiesce in a situation where the U.S. is already taking all the blame for doing this sort of dirty compromise. And anyway, so my sense is that it could be pretty significant. Now, I don't actually think the U.S. will forswear all future NATO enlargement, and you're right, Jacob. The security guarantees is really key here, and I think the U.S. I think what we've seen over and over is that the West doesn't really want to give real obligatory security guarantees, and Russia wouldn't accept them anyway. And so the result is some piece of paper that has to look robust enough on paper that it's better than the Budapest Memorandum, even though everyone will walk away knowing that it's the same as the Budapest Memorandum.
Okay, so here's what I think is critical here. I think Europe's role is really critical. I think both of you are massively dismissing it. Why? Because I think that secretly Europeans want the war to continue. And I've only really come to that conclusion very recently. Because the war started in many ways because the Biden administration decided to support a much more aggressive Ukraine. Obviously, and Putin is to blame for the war in Ukraine. I'm not discounting that. But there was an agreement. It was the Minsk agreement negotiating by the Europeans. It was unfair to Ukraine, but whatever. Europeans didn't care. They were like, look, let's just put this to rest because we don't want a war. And then the war happened. And it was very painful for Europe. The entire continent went into a current account deficit due to energy costs. Very, very bad. People were talking about Europeans freezing. They survived that. And now 3 years into the war, like this has given Europe as a joint entity a raison d'etre, to use European language. They're nation building. I mean, hell, they're even doing things like M&A in financial system because of this. Like this war has infused Europe with so much energy, whether it's to rearm. Germany's talking about conscription. European Commission is talking about completing the single market integration. And I think that Europeans just know they're on the hook for Ukraine either way, whether you're rebuilding it or financing the war. So I actually think that Europe is comfortable continuing to support Ukraine. And because of that, on its own, by the way, and any notion that they can't do it is ludicrous. Of course they can. Number one, they have money. Number two, they have printing presses if they need to print the money. They printed money to buy more expensive gas, like relax. Europe is rich. They can finance this war. And third of all, yeah, they do have weapons. They do. Enough to keep the Russians at bay. And by the way, the Russians are so bad at war. Let me just remind everyone listening to this that they conquer Avdiivka in February 2024, and now they're going to conquer Pokrovsk. For those of you who can't use Google Map, let me just tell you, they are 65 kilometers away. It took the Russians 2 years to move 65 kilometers. So pump the brakes on this whole idea that like this war has to end tomorrow or else Ukraine will fall apart. I think Europe is comfortable financing them, and they're secretly not really telling why, because it's very self-serving and Machiavellian. So the question then becomes, what does Ukraine want? And here, Jacob, I agree with you on this. I think Zelensky has gotten better, and not just being like, so black and white, so 1 and 0, so binary. He's saying like, look, let me read the proposal. Now, why? Because I think he wants to extract the most he can. If you're going to sell a piece of real estate, you're going to want a high price. And so if he's going to give up any territory, if he's going to even softly agree to like disagree with Moscow for the next 50 years, he needs something back. And I think that's what you're getting, Jacob. I agree with you. And he now knows Europeans are committed to financing this war. So he does have some cards, And so I think, one thing I would introduce to this is some polling, though, that does suggest that Ukrainians are starting to lose faith in the war. And so I have a poll from the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, which has really good polling on just sentiment of Ukrainians. It shows that at the end of 2023, only about 20% of Ukrainians agreed with the view that Ukraine may give up some territory to achieve peace as soon as possible. So only 1 in 5 Ukrainians at the end of 23 was like, sure, we'll need to give some territory. Now it's at 40. It's at 40%. And it's increased significantly, and not just because Trump got elected and they feel abandoned. No, that's not why. It actually started declining well before that. Now, at a similar poll shows that there's still about 60% of Ukrainians who are willing to endure the war forever. But I think that we need to kind of really think about these two polls. Yes, I think Ukrainians are willing to fight Russians forever if Russians want to conquer Kiev or eastern Ukraine. But what the Russians are saying by acquiescing to this 28-point plan is that they just want the northwestern villages of Donetsk, that they're too incompetent to conquer themselves. And so, just to put a point to conclude all of this, I think Europeans and Ukrainians are effectively saying, bro, if you want it, come and get it. Oh, but you're really bad at actual war. Why are we going to give up everything because you don't know how to fight? I mean, this is the truth. The truth is Russians are terrible at this. We're talking about a territory the size of like Delaware that they cannot conquer for 4 years almost now. And so the question I think that we need to answer, and I'm being a little facetious here, but a little aggressive, but the question is like, why? Why give Putin that last sliver of territory? Why not just like squeeze him? Now you might say, well, you're squeezing Ukraine too. And I've always been the first to say that. Anyone who's followed this podcast or heard me speak, I'm always like, hey, you're bleeding Ukraine. But Ukrainians seem to be kind of okay with that. Europeans seem to be okay with financing it for Machiavellian self-serving reasons. You know, like, why not just force Russia to prove itself in the field of battle, which, again, it hasn't done. To restate a very critical point, it took him a year and a half to move 65 kilometers. Let's pump the brakes on the Russians knowing what they do. They don't. So why not force them to go that extra mile themselves? Anyways,
Yeah,
I'm open to counters.
I feel like sometimes my job is to be the optimist to your bathing in nihilism, Marco. But I feel like I'm going to be even more cynical than you here for a moment. First of all, though, I want to push back on this thing about Donetsk, because this proposal is not just Donetsk; it's about large swaths of Zaporizhia and Kherson.
They already control. Wait, Jacob, wait, hold on. I got to interrupt you right away. It is just about that, and here's why: Russians control the rest, and Ukrainians have no chance to reconquer it. For as bad as Russians are at offense, so are Ukrainians. So the reason it is just about northwestern Donetsk is because that's the only piece of territory that Ukrainians currently control that the 28-point plan would force them to give to the Russians.
Yeah, and to your point, if you're thinking about this as a real estate transaction, then giving up this land that has been absolutely destroyed and mined and everything else and saying, okay, you can have this really terrible land that you've destroyed, like, okay, you could sort of see the diminishing returns on that. I've been fairly complimentary of Zelensky all year. I pushed back against you when you said that he made a mistake in the White House. But
you have,
yeah.
And I concede. I concede that. Well, I think you were right.
Well, the 28-point plan said that he had to call elections within 100 days. And the 19-point plan says that he has to call elections as soon as possible. So if we're being cynical about Zelensky's political future, he has every incentive for this not to work, because as soon as this deal goes into effect, he has to start getting the wheels turning on Ukrainian elections, and probably he doesn't win the next Ukrainian election, if I had to guess. I don't know if you have a poll on that. I also just wanted to call out, this is all about the money. Like, one of the most shocking things to me in the 28-point plan was this provision that, hold on, I'm going to pull it up here, that all these frozen Russian assets are going to be invested in U.S.-led efforts to rebuild and invest in Ukraine, and that the U.S. will receive 50% of the profits from this venture, and that the United States and Russia will put together their own fund, investment vehicle, I don't know what the heck to call it, to
I had to mute myself because I'm laughing because you were going with that. I'm sorry.
No, we're aimed at strengthening relations and increasing common interest to create a strong incentive not to return to the conflict. And the European, they're the ones who want to rebuild it. So everybody's looking at the situation and being like, no, we want to be in line to get the money to rebuild these things that war has destroyed. So there's that. The last thing, though, I just want to say is that it seems to me that the part of this that is going to make this like every single other time, and this is where I'd appreciate pushback from you guys, is this separate proposal about a security guarantee to Ukraine. Because even if Putin gets some document that says that, okay, NATO is not going to be enlarged and Ukraine is not going to join NATO, there's a parallel proposal that says Ukraine gets a security guarantee that is like the NATO security guarantee. So
Yeah.
is Putin really going to say yes when part of this deal is that there's a separate deal that says no, they won't join NATO, but they get a security guarantee? We'll call it the Trump security guarantee. It's not a NATO security guarantee. It's not Article 5. We're not calling it that, but we're giving them that. I don't see a planet in which Vladimir Putin
But,
can acquiesce to that. That's the red line, isn't it? Am I
well,
crazy?
the thing is that the security guarantee that they may end up producing could just be a document. That's the thing is if it doesn't spell out that it really would be a coordinated military intervention by the multilateral guarantors, then that's just a piece of paper, right? That people can say, okay, we guarantee Ukraine's security, but they don't make any concrete pledges. So, for example, it would have to be referred to the UN Security Council and discussed, and of course, we all know where that goes. So, I'm just saying that I agree with you in the sense that Russia can't agree to it if it's real, but if it's unreal, then what you could have is simply a situation. Now, this is maybe where you guys won't agree, but Russia can basically accept the terms the U.S. is offering to get the sanction relief. And the question is, does it really need the rest of the Donetsk for domestic consumption? I actually think that Putin doesn't actually need it. He can actually freeze his line on the current line of control. The American agreement can state that this is supposed to be a demilitarized zone, and that would be the implication. But you don't actually have to have Ukrainians pull back immediately. You just have the Russians stop shooting, and then the Americans lift sanctions. And that's why I think those are the two key players here. Because if Russia stops shooting and the U.S. lifts sanctions on Russia, then yeah, I mean Ukraine can try to take European money to re-escalate the war. But at that point, the Europeans might start thinking that that's a waste of time. So,
Look,
that's why I think this could actually lead somewhere.
look. I agree too, Matt. I do think it can lead to something. And all I'm saying is this: it has to come down to Ukraine saying like, okay, we've had enough. That's who I actually think is the only player. So that's where maybe I disagree with you, Matt. Like if Russia and America come to an agreement, but Ukraine's like, no, like, and they're financed by somebody who's like, yeah, we'll support you for our own reasons. Where I would go here, though, is that I don't think Russia cares about strategic interests. I'm in that camp. I might be the only guy on that island. I got a condo on it. Bill Browder comes and visits. We order pizza because he's, I think, the only other guy who has my view, which is like, I don't think Putin gives a fuck. Like NATO Schmado, he's gonna be dead. He's cool, man. Like whatever. Like give him security guarantees. I got what I wanted. I like the creativity of your thinking, though, Matt. Could he freeze the lines here and like not care about the northwestern corner of Donetsk? Maybe. I think though that he wants to call up his buddy George W. Bush, get the mission accomplished banner, hang it, declare
Yeah.
victory. And it's neater. It's just like neater that it is all of Donbas.
But if he gets to shake the U.S. president's hand and the U.S. de facto recognizes this territory and there's sanction removal, are Russian people not going to see that as a
Yeah.
victory?
I like the creativity of that. That's
Yeah.
cool. I think you could be able to sell it. If the three of us were in his like office at the end of that incredibly long phallic table, like the three of us are like on the very other tip, right?
I don't want to be there.
You know what? But if we were, and you proposed that to Vladimir, I think he would be like, "Yeah, I like I like the cut of your jib." But listen,
Pat on the head.
where am I getting with this? What I'm getting at this is that ultimately, like the reason Europeans are as aggressive, I think, as they are right now, and the reason they always come out and say this is stupid, everyone thinks it's because they are defending liberal internationalism. Everybody thinks they're defending the sanctity of borders, right? That's what the commentary in America kind of says. And what I think is like once the Europeans realized, and it took them 2 years or so, it took me this long to figure out. And by the way, it was a help of my Greek buddy Kostas. He knows who he is. Love you, brother. But he like convinced me of this because I was like just arguing with my buddy. And he's like, no, man. Like, I think Europeans are cool with this. He's right. And here's why. But he's only right now that we know that Putin does not have strategic plans, that he's not going to use nukes. Finland is in NATO, and he's like, what? Finland's in NATO? Like, I didn't notice, whatever. I'm not hearing it, blah, 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 blah. No, it's not. Like, once Europeans realize this really is just about Russian domestic politics, when they realize that Putin is just doing this for petty reasons, he really does just want northwestern Donetsk villages, then Europeans get to kind of, the threat of nuclear war is much lower. The Poles get to fly around their F-16s. Everybody gets to like puff out their chest, be peacocks, and build their defense industry, which is just a fiscal stimulus and just a jobs program. My point is that that's what emboldens them to support Ukraine, because this has now become a war over villages nobody can find on Google Maps. People don't even know where this is. And because of that, I think the pettiness of it could extend the conflict. Although I am in your camp, Matt, that I think we do have to discuss it, even though it's the fourth time and Jacob's tired. I think that we are the closest we've ever been, but it really just comes down to Ukraine and how exhausted they are. As another one of my buddies, also Emin pointed out. I'm just shouting out some of my Greek Armenian buddies. This is clearly I'm informed by Ottoman discussions about this.
Real quick.
I want to say something real quick, which is, first of all, you said about Russians being shitty at war, Marco. This idea of a U.S.-Russia joint venture for economic prosperity in the region. You think the Russians are bad at war? Watch what they do with capitalism. They're really shitty at that. I can't believe we want a joint venture with these people. And to your point about Putin being petty, he's only had to downgrade his ambitions. His real goal is to conquer all of Ukraine. He believes that Ukraine doesn't exist.
No,
that Ukraine should be part of Russia.
Yes,
he does. He totally believes.
Care. No, yes, he doesn't.
He deeply
cares. That's
cares.
like, I believe that I will get a six-pack. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't matter. Like, he doesn't. He can't get it. He's not going to get it. And so therefore, he's like, I'll take what I can. I don't think he does. I don't think Putin looks beyond his lifetime. Somebody who's strategic truly believes that I'm here to help Russia gain its whatever. I just don't think he thinks like that at all. I think he just wants to be a trillionaire, which he is. God bless him.
Well,
and that's it.
And we'll never get down to the end of it. But to me, it comes down to this point, and maybe I'm making it too simplistic, which is I don't think, and maybe you'll push back against this by saying he's just petty and he wants the villages in Donetsk. But I don't think Putin can agree to anything that includes a security guarantee for Ukraine. And I don't think Zelensky can agree to anything that doesn't have a robust security guarantee for Ukraine itself. And to your point, I agree. I think Zelensky and Ukraine can keep fighting, and that the Europeans will support them. And I don't think some sort of elegant, one China-esque sort of diplomatic, wordsmithing is going to get us around that. Either there is a security guarantee or there isn't a security guarantee. And unless one of them have given up because of their domestic constraints, like, I think we'll just be in the exact same disagreement, because Trump will look at the Russians and be like, okay, do we have a deal? And Vladimir will be like, well, have you torn up the security guarantee thing? And Trump will be like, no, I gave them the real proposal. He's like, okay, well, there's no deal. And then he goes to Zelensky and says, do we have a deal? And he's like, well, where's my security guarantee? It doesn't have to be NATO, but it has to be a security guarantee.
But see, this is why we're overrating Ukraine's agency here, because they would have to fight on without any American support, no intelligence support, no funding. I take Marco's point. Europe may be willing to extend the funding for longer than we expect, but how long? And can it really compensate for the total absence of American cooperation? I mean, what if America starts actively undermining Ukraine? What if America threatens to give Russia control of the Black Sea? Specifically Odessa, like a key part of this negotiation is that Ukraine can still export goods. And you would expect that the Americans would uphold their normal interest of saying, well, Russia's not going to be able to turn this into a lake. But if the Americans let the Russians casually blockade Ukrainian exports, that's pretty devastating, even from a European point of view, to their economic viability. So it's just, I'm not sure.
Really.
I'm not sure that. Yeah, I think it is. Of course, they've
their
got
exports
railroads.
their exports have rerouted through the Baltic and through other ports. Look. Here's what I would say.
But the point here, though, just to drive this a little further, is Ukraine can wage. You're saying that Ukraine can wage this war independently with just European support indefinitely, and I'm thinking,
no, not indefinitely.
Yeah, maybe another year.
I'm saying long enough. Long enough that Jacob has to listen to this for the fifth and sixth time. And long enough, look, what we're debating here is whether this is over right now. Like,
No,
can
yeah.
Ukraine wage the war for another 6 months to get a better deal?
Definitely. And the
To
other thing
get
is,
Russians to prove that they can conquer more than 60 kilometers in 18 months? Like, those are my questions, right? Like,
yeah,
my point is just this, Matt. If Northwest Donetsk has to be handed over to Russia, I think Ukraine and Europe are going to say why. Let them prove it.
you to your point, even my own view that I'm sort of expounding here, it still allows for another 12 months, because if you think
Yeah.
about Russia's own belief is that they can break that barrier, obtain that last piece of land, and then Trump before the midterm is going to want a deal just as badly as he wants one right now. So, their own
But you just
perspective is
answered. You
6 to
just
9 months.
answered. Maybe so. Here's a potential solution to this. Russians eventually win what they want, which is this northwestern corner of Donetsk, the size of Delaware. But it just takes them another 18 to 24 months to do it. I'm not saying that's actually going to happen. I think Ukraine will sell that piece of territory for something cooler. The problem for Ukraine is this. The problem for Ukraine is that they just let Russia conquer that organically. Well, then you don't extract anything from the West, namely from Trump, who seems to be obsessed with a deal. You see what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
like, if Ukraine, like, there was an EU membership in that 28-point plan. There's all sorts of goodies. Like, you don't want to just sit there and let Russia just slowly, incompetently, and terribly eventually get that. You want to sell it. Because I think even with European or even with American help, you're going to lose that. We all agree with that. Russians are terrible, but yes, eventually in 36 months, they'll conquer. 24 months, 18 months, they'll get it. So I think Ukraine does have an incentive to get a deal. I just don't know if they can parlay European support for European Machiavelli reasons for a little bit better deal from Americans and Russians. Now, one thing I have for you guys is, why does Trump want the deal? And like, the answer is Nobel Peace Prize. But wait, let's pump the brakes. I think, Jacob, what you're pointing out, all these cool deals with Russia and we're going to have joint ventures. There's two ways that a liberal might say what's going on here. Trump wants a Nobel Peace Prize. And second, Trump wants to make money with, Vladimir Putin in a joint venture. Okay, fine. I have a third option.
Okay.
I think that a bunch of third-rate strategists that Trump has employed as his foreign policy advisors have convinced him that he can flip Russia away from China. It just smells to me.
The
Listen.
return of the reverse Nixon. God,
Yeah.
somebody light my hair on
It
fire.
just smells like it, though. It smells like it. It smells like, hey, Russia, we're going to do all these great things together. And,
Well, Marco, I actually showed a letter of this. I don't know if you read some of the reporting on this, but apparently the genesis for getting serious about this deal was that Jared Kushner saw the success around the Gaza peace plan and really pushed Trump to say, now's the time that you can really go for Ukraine, Russia. So he went to Jared. I think what you're smelling is that
but
he
listen,
went to Jared.
What I would say about this is, like, I really think Trump's, like, enthusiasm, naivete, and optimism is good for the world. Like, he's like, I can flip anyone. And he takes it as a challenge that someone says no. The only problem is that if Russia has any sense, like, if Russia has modest IQ geopolitically, it knows it can't trust America. You cannot trust America on this. You're 2 years away from AOC becoming president, scrapping every single bit of that deal. You know what I mean? So, like, if you're Russia, I just think the only thing I would say, if anyone is listening to this podcast from the White House, I would just tell you this right now. You can't, like, they're not going to listen to you. You know what I mean? You're not going to be able to reverse the Russians because they can't trust the next administration. It may not be that you're not being genuine. It's just that it's very difficult, I think, to do that. But it does smell to me like that could be one of the reasons. But yes, I do also think that Trump just wants to end the war. He thinks it's pointless.
Also, though, there's no way that American strategists are thinking, like, I know what you're saying, Marco, but they're not thinking that Russia's trustworthy on the issue of realigning to rejoin the West, and especially not given everything you've just said about Europe, right? If Europe's whole idea is that they're going to soak the Russians and mobilize their own economy by opposition to Russia, then that certainly doesn't pave the way for a realignment of Russia, even if the Americans did want it and did think that Russia could deliver it.
It's, as you know, Matt, it's something that's very popular in the more right of center circles. And
Yeah.
by the way, I myself have written about this. One of the worst pieces of geopolitical analysis I've ever done was in 2021 when I thought that Russia was about to flip. And, they had an opportunity to. They had an opportunity. They had an opening. But I think that they correctly knew that wouldn't work.
That goes back to the issue here, which is that those two economies actually are fairly complementary these days. I think one thing I hear over and over again from people who were sort of bred in the international relations and academia background is that Russia and China don't like each other. And
that's bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah. These irrelevant points about the fact, a lot of countries don't like each other. Nobody likes each other. The point is that the China in the 1960s that was competing with Russia was not a resource import dependent China that was heavily industrialized, and Russia at that time wasn't as starving for capital as they are today. So the relationship is actually pretty strong, and it would be completely irresponsible for their strategists on either side to try to betray each other. And it would also be irresponsible for the Americans to truly betray Russia for the embrace of, to betray Europe for the embrace of Russia. So these things are just unfortunately pretty fixed. Trump,
you hear that a lot, though.
Trump. Well, I know you do. Trump. I'm just saying, Trump gets some credit for recognizing that kicking the can down the road is actually a good policy, and basically prolonging the negotiation because if you don't, you wind up in a bifurcated, Russo-Chinese bloc versus the West, which I think is where we're going anyway. But there's a big difference between going there tomorrow and going there in 20 years.
Yeah, I want to get to that, but before we go, can Conspiracy Jacob just make a brief appearance here?
Please.
I'm feeling the.
We need a hat. We need a hat for it.
I need the. I don't think I have a hat in here. I'll get a Conspiracy Jacob hat. Okay, this is Conspiracy Jacob. I have a birthday crown that my daughter gave me. Hold on, I can do that.
Yes, let's do that.
All right, this is great. Here we go, guys. For those of you watching on YouTube, all right, Conspiracy Jacob. Here's my unfounded conspiracy. Maybe when Donald's on the phone with Xi Jinping, what Xi Jinping is saying is, this Vladimir guy, he's losing it a little bit. I hung out with him a couple weeks ago. He's talking about harvesting organs from young children. Like, the guy has lost the plot a little bit. So could you please stabilize this? Because if he keeps doing what he's doing, he's going to fall, and I'm going to have a total clusterfuck on my border. So you want me to buy the soybeans? You want the trade war to be relaxed? You want everything else? You make a Russia-Ukraine peace deal. And then, you could talk with us about buying your soybeans and other things. How do you like Conspiracy Jacob? You like that?
That was good. That was good.
I mean, it does sound like a lot of the stuff I see on the internet. No offense, but the thing is that there's this responsible stakeholder version of China that just will not die, and I don't say this out of hatred of China. I just say it out of observation, where China is supposed to be the one that brings this war to a conclusion, and really it could pretty easily if it actually did start to punish Russia on the import channel, and it just doesn't really do that because it doesn't see an interest in doing it.
I like the way Matt said, it sounds like what I see on the internet. Matt, what do you think we do for a living here, my friend? Actually, we don't do it for a living because we don't get paid, but...
Well, I guess maybe I mean on the social... on the
socials.
Social networking.
On the interwebs.
Maybe there's a joint Russia venture for two cousins in Russia to join with us. I don't know.
Jacob, you're going to get aggregated. That view is going to get...
We want me to be aggregated.
That's right. That's right.
That would be great. That's a great problem for us to have.
But to your point, Jacob, you could be onto something in this way, though. If China actually delivers on this energy dialogue that Xi Jinping and Trump talked about, and we see a large increase in oil purchases, then that does implicitly displace Russian imports, and I think it would signal that tactically Xi Jinping is telling Putin it's time to move toward a ceasefire. I don't think he really has an interest in doing that, but maybe that would happen.
Unless he has a sense that things are getting bad in Russia. Because I think I'm more on Team Ukrainian agency than any of you, because I think Ukraine can continue this indefinitely. I think they've shown that they can use their drones to knock out Russian energy infrastructure and everything else. And Zelensky is finally in the position where he can look at Vladimir Putin and say, fine, you want to do this forever? Like, yes, I can't take back these villages in Donetsk, but I can make it really hurt for you. Like,
Yeah,
I
it's
finally
asymmetric.
have something I can push.
Well, it's
So,
asymmetric. You're right. It's asymmetric. Like,
That's true.
you know, and by the way, all of this is a product of Russia just not being tough enough in a way to use like tactical nukes and all this other stuff. They are not willing to take it to that level. So Ukraine can now poke them. Europeans feel relatively safe to finance this. And I think it's brought us down to where I agree with Matt. I think we're close to the end. I just think
okay, well,
that, you know, like Zelensky just needs a little bit more. He needs to prove himself to be a little bit tougher and then sell for the highest price. That's not a bad strategy. And by the way, that was your original point, Jacob, when you and I disagreed. So
a broken clock is right twice a day, Marco. Okay, so let's close then with this, because I think we have about 20 minutes left. I don't know how long you guys can go, but I have about 20 minutes before I have to go. So let's say that you guys are both right. Let's say that I'm wrong about this. And let's say that we get a deal, whether
well, what
it's
are
the
we right about?
19.1.
Can
Let's
we
say that there's a
just,
deal,
well,
like a
what's
deal in the next
like in the
2
next 3
months.
months?
I
Yeah,
think
in the
I
next.
think the window should be the U.S. midterm. That's the window here, because Russia might want to push one more time in the spring, and Trump wants a deal before the midterm, and that's where if Putin just delays forever, then at some point Trump probably loses appetite to give him so many goodies.
Okay, well let's take that then. Let's say there's a deal by the midterms. I think that's a little long, but that's fine. Let's grant the point. So there's a deal by the midterms. How does the world change geopolitically? Like when our clients are coming to us like many months from now before the midterms and there is a deal, what does that look like? Are we talking about joint Russia-US ventures running around to rebuild Ukraine? Are we talking about, unlimited corn and sunflower and wheat exports from the Black Sea so we don't have to worry about that anymore? Are we talking about Ukraine being welcomed into the EU? Like, what is Russia getting flipped? Is China getting flipped? Who's getting flipped? What's getting flipped? Like, if there is a deal, like, what's the next day look like from your guys' perspective?
Well, I don't think there's any more exports. So I published a chart. It's now a little bit outdated, but actually, Ukraine is back in terms of its exports of wheat to, it's not completely back to the pre-war levels, but it is pretty much there. You're talking maybe a couple of million tons more of annual wheat exports. So it's down to about 16, maybe a little bit higher. It was at 20, so maybe you could get a couple of million barrels of a couple of million tons of wheat out of Ukraine more. I think the world is changed because, I do think EU membership is on the cards for Ukraine. Absolutely. I think the EU wants those migrants through the labor market. I think they want to rebuild Ukraine, and I think there'll be a feeding frenzy for that. I think Ukraine becomes a garrison state, and quite frankly, I think it's going to be a great economic development story. Yes, there's corruption. Yes, there's problems. Honestly, those things exist in South Korea to this day, and it didn't matter. So I think you've got a very large piece of European territory that's going to get rebuilt, and it's going to be a pretty interesting source of innovation, dynamism. These are veterans. This is their greatest generation rebuilding. Like you're talking like 35 million Ukrainians just bulled up about holding Russia at the gates. It's incredible. I think it's a cool story. On all the other stuff, I think there isn't much that difference. Like I don't think we can go pre-February. I don't think the sanctions are going to be completely removed against Russia. They're already exporting all the oil they were going to export anyways. Diesel, that's something that is going to flood the markets. I think that could cause oil prices to go down as Russian diesel floods the market. But I think any trade that happens after the war ends is temporary. I don't think Europeans don't remilitarize. I think they do. As I said earlier, I think it's a fiscal and jobs program. It's like the nation building program. I don't think they reverse all of those things. So I think what happened in February 2022, we're in that world. We're in a post-February 2022 world. It's not like central banks who bought all the gold because America weaponized the dollar are going to oh, we don't need this gold. Let's sell it. You know what I mean? I think what happened in February 2022 is still here with us, I think there's just a regional story of like, wow, Ukraine is the next South Korea, effectively, a next economic development story.
Yeah, it's interesting. One thing is that I see it as sort of the best of both worlds for Europe. You know, Marco, you were making the case that Europe would actually prolong the war, but Europe can greatly benefit by the idea that the war is sort of closed off and put at least behind a ceasefire. But then all the other things you said are still true. Like they have to
Yeah.
stimulate their own economy, re-gear their industry. They have to continue to think long term about military buildup because, of course, there's still this risk of Russia being belligerent in the future because that's all stemming from Russia's long term economic and social decline. So that you do have to be prepared for some future Russian aggression, even if it never materializes.
Yeah,
So,
for sure. I mean,
so you get private
yeah.
capital coming out of the woodwork in Europe that was intimidated by the war, and you'd be matching that with the fiscal. I guess that's another way of saying what you were saying, which is that this would be very bullish for Europe and not just Ukraine.
Well, one thing I would say is that, sorry to interrupt you, Matt, I was just going to jive on top of you and say, like, well, you know, I've painted a picture of Putin as a kleptocrat who doesn't really care about strategic issues, right? But like, there could be something that comes after him. So absolutely, this is why I'm buying any dip in like defense stocks in Europe. You know, like that's kind of what I'm getting at. But I think Jacob, yeah. So we're on the same. But Jacob, where I think you want to go, I can feel it. I can feel it in your pores. Like you want to go to what happens to Russia, right? So here I am talking about Ukraine. Matt's talking about Europe. But the truth is, like, and I've said this before on this pod, Russia has an incredibly long history of effectively losing offensive military operations, and having political change afterwards, you know? And I think that there's no way that the current regime in Russia, like, survives the peace. I think Putin will declare a victory. I think he'll ride that victory wave for a couple of months, maybe years even, you know, like he will make us look stupid, Jacob. You and I have been sitting here for 3 years being like, oh, Putin's done. Well, egg on our face, or a bleeding on our face, better. But I think that eventually Putin ends up, I think the regime crumbles because what they got from Ukraine is so little. And the resources they expanded are so great that I think eventually the big takeaway from this conflict is that there must be a reckoning inside of Russia. And that may not be good because while Marco's here saying like, well, I don't think Putin cares. He just wants some villages so he can get the mission accomplished banner and declare victory. Maybe what replaces him is someone who actually believes in the historical lesson he taught Tucker Carlson on that pod.
Yeah. Well, to your point, I mean, this is where, I mean, Tsar Nicholas II lasted, after he got his ass whooped by the Japanese in 1904, 1905, lasted another 12 years. Now, he had to install the Duma in between then, and you had the beginning of the First World War. But we don't get the Russian Revolution until 1917. And I just bring that up to say, you know, maybe it'll take 10 years. Maybe Putin harvests some organs from kids and he lasts another 10 or 15 years. But when that regime does fall apart, it will have global impact. I mean, it'll probably reverberate in ways we're not even thinking of.
There was an attempted revolution in 1905. So, you know,
sorry.
So one thing I always point out is, and I mean, I'm not just entirely relying on the historical analogies. They're useful, but I mean, you do have a strong reason to believe that social unrest will bubble up sooner than people realize because there will be a big drop in industrial production. And so there'll be effectively a recession after the war. And this is the biggest pushback I get when I put forward that. And so here, my whole point about the ceasefire or whatever is that Putin needs to embrace Trump while he has this potential of getting sanction relief and a sort of great power status by doing a deal directly with the United States, because that probably does buy him some time at home. Whereas the idea that the war ends in sort of a whimper after just dragging on forever and you don't get any sanction relief and you don't get any improved prestige or status, that could just...
No, I love that point.
That could
I love that point, Matt.
You know, the image of Putin as weak and failed, and he's got a, you know,
you're saying
almost a wasteland ahead of him.
You're almost saying he should actually sell the northwestern part of Donetsk he hasn't conquered.
Yes, but
That's
and the point there is
really
that,
nuanced.
and of course this is extremely contentious because it requires you to say that Putin is not just fanatical about the war, right? But you know, the Putin that we've seen in the past used to take calculated risks. The belief
Yeah.
from 2022 to now is that he became unhinged. But I guess I'm saying, well, what if it's the same Putin and he actually does still recognize that risks can be calculated, and that
I
he needs
mean,
to, if you're going to start turning the Titanic, you better start turning now.
Matt, how can anyone argue that he's completely unhinged? You know, like I mean,
Yeah,
there's levels of unhinged. He
right.
he only mobilized the people once, hasn't used tactical nukes, and so on. Now, in terms of historical analogies, for those who want to kind of like count them, Nicholas the First effectively committed suicide. Nobody knows why he died, but this was Crimean War. What followed was Alexander II, massive, massive macroeconomic social reforms of Russia, kind
Right.
of like the stuff going on in Saudi Arabia now, like the Meiji Restoration. Then
Freed
you've got free to serve and so on. You guys have put up forth the Nicholas II example of 1905. Great nuanced point with Japan. But I would also argue First World War and the Bolshevik Revolution were also a product of an offensive imperialist war. Russia's participation in World War I was not defensive like, fighting Hitler. They were doing it to conquer as much of Poland and Silesia and all sorts of other parts. And then finally, you can talk about Soviet Union with Afghanistan, right? I mean, Gorbachev followed because there was angst, there was like malaise, not just economic, also political, due to this very, very painful war. And then Chechnya and Yeltsin, which was an albatross around his neck for 10 years, effectively, which brought Putin into power. It was his first big success, was solving this. So I think that, it's not just like analogies. At some point, it becomes like this is what happens to Russia. You get a regime because the place expands beyond some almost supernatural limits of the country. Like there's just something out there keeping Russia the size it is. And every time its leaders are like, I want to grab another piece, they always fail. At the same time, to their credit, and let's just give them the credit that's due. I don't want some Russian to think we're anti Russian. Look, when somebody tries to invade Russia, they like save the fucking world, right? God bless you. Napoleon, Hitler, we get that. But when it's the other way around, they always fail and it always leads to political risk. So if I was going to pick the most significant, to answer your question, Jacob, which is an incredible question, what after? I think it's that. We've got a great power that's in a process of effectively decaying. We've got a new Eastern question. We've got a new sick man of Eurasia. We got a new sphere of influence for great powers to fight over. And that might be the defining part of the next 25 years.
Well, and this declining power segment of Europe has how many nuclear warheads? Is it 4,000? I forget the exact number. Like that's the thing that keeps
I
me
think
up
it's
at night
like
about this.
20,000.
7,000
Enough.
deployed. Here's the thing. Yeah, enough. Look, one other issue, though, by the way, we've backed into this actually does enable you to understand U.S. strategy separate from Donald Trump. Is that if the U.S. allows Russia to be ground into the ground, then we one of two things happens: either they elect or have a revolution and have a more fanatical, aggressive government, or they become a pure satellite to China, and we effectively solve the coordination problem between Russia and China. The U.S. outcome would be much preferred to have something in between, to have the devil that we know, which is a federation, that isn't a satellite and isn't a completely fascist, militaristic state, and
Yeah,
basically,
but
yeah,
what if it's the eastern part of Russia gets to be a satellite of China and Moscow becomes the
yeah.
29th member of the European Union? Like what if we're talking about like a complete
Ooh,
redivision of the
No,
lines,
I
but
still,
here's the thing: with nuclear
that's,
weapons, it's hard for states with nuclear weapons uh, to completely, like, look at Pakistan, right? You could have the Pakistanization of Russia, where it is effectively a nuclear military regime surrounded by chaos, but for the territory to actually break apart, it seems pretty far fetched these days.
No, listen, I think Matt is very correct. And this is the role the UK also played in the 19th century after the Crimean War. I mean, after the Crimean War, not before it, but the UK was like, holy shit, we've unleashed these forces, the Russians, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, the various nations of Ottoman Empire, they all now want a peace. What have we done? We got to like pump the brakes a little bit on some of this stuff. So I think you're right. Like, I don't think the United States is going, like, they may very well start acting not because Trump wants to build Trump hotels in like Omsk, but because it is in America's interest that this huge piece of Eurasia does not get nibbled on by any emerging power. China's the obvious one, but even like places like Turkey or Europe, even Europe.
Well, Turkey's already nibbling, and Europe's you're all coming back to
Oh,
conspiracy Jacob, which is China saying, "Hey, you've got a Eurasian problem. Why don't you fix this shit that you just started?" Like
Turkey's
I
nibbling
know
for sure. Everyone's nibbling, but this is hey, this is why we're in a growth industry, my friends. Okay, because the 19th century is back. Let me tell you something. If the world is bipolar or unipolar, it's going to be boring. Okay, at the end of the day, the great thing about multipolarity is there's a whole lot of nibbling going on, and that makes it fun.
Yeah, that's true. And I mean, to that point, I mean, obviously, Jacob, you're right that there are some marginal Russian territories that we could see some really crazy stuff happen. I mean, I'm not denying that, but anyway, one last thing. China is a missing part of this post-Ukraine world you asked about. Because on one hand, they're not going to be thrilled to see Russia make amends with the West if that's what ends up happening. But if it's a standoff, then I suppose they can sort of take some lessons from that about their own strategy in the future. And they're not just thinking about Taiwan, but obviously they're pretty fixated on Taiwan. The question to me becomes, do they risk being isolated? And that goes back to our discussion that we covered. There is no Nixon strategy here. You can't, or reverse Nixon, you can't really convince Germany and Russia and the United States to all engage in the same international order and embrace a liberalization and a cooperation. There's not a good basis for that. There's a basis for détente, but in the end, Russia's very likely to continue to sort of cast its strategic future with Russia and vice versa.
But I would say that there is in this emerging world an opportunity to have shifting alliances based on the issue. You know,
Yeah, as long
like
as countries
that's
are sustainable. Yeah, as long as they're domestically sustainable, they can sort
like
of bumper cars.
yeah, like and that's why I was really, really so like nauseated by this notion that India, Russia, and China are now allies at the Tianjin summit. Like I just like lost. I mean, Jacob knows. Like I almost like got a brain aneurysm on our podcast. I was actually invited by CNBC or someone to talk about it live, and I was like, rah, like just walked off the set like, you guys are fools. And it's like
Yeah,
no, but at the same time it doesn't mean that there's an alliance. They're not. India hasn't joined China, Russia. It just means that on issue X, like there could be a war. There could be a actual war where the three countries are sharing a view. You know what I mean? There could be another war where they're not. They could be in an alliance structure against each other. It's just a little more shifting, and I think that we all need to approach this geopolitical world with less nuance and worry a little bit less about who's in whose camp. In other words, it's kind of like playing Risk. When you play Risk, there's a ton of diplomacy going on. Hey, please don't attack me right now. I won't attack you in Latin America if you don't attack me in Oceania. People make these alliances all the time. And what's fun about Risk is all the stuff that's not on the board. When you play the game of Risk, what's most fun about Risk is what's not on the board. Like, oh, I'm just so poor. I just have Australia. And then like 20 turns later, you're like, ha ha ha. And you're like, but I let you have Australia. Too bad, Matt. Like, fuck you.
yeah,
And then, like that's what's fun.
yeah.
And that's all I'm saying.
That's why you can have that game of diplomacy, which you barely even use the board.
Yeah. Well, that would
Well,
last like years. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? At least
sure.
risk,
I've
risk and
now
last a
to be
bottle of
clear,
wine.
for that same reason, I've only played that game once. But hey,
Yeah.
look, the one maybe thing I would sort of tag on here though is that you do have to have domestic economies that are sustainable, and for the most part, we're seeing that. I mean, Europe, U.S., China, these are for the most part pretty sustainable economies. They're not getting the growth that they want, but they're not collapsing or anything. But I just keep mentioning that as a caveat, whether people are asking about, civil war in the U.S. or whether they're asking about collapse of Russia or whether they're asking about China attacking Taiwan, or, it's very important to continue to maintain productivity and growth, because if we lose those things, then you could really start to see the demons come out in terms of how these territorial tensions play out.
Yeah.
That's a good point, man.
Marco, I think you made a great point too, which is the last thing I want to say. Two things last. Number one, the country that has the most to gain from all of this is Turkey. They're the ones like at the risk table who they had Oceania. They got their small part of Syria, and in 20 turns, they might be the one banging on the table like Marco right there, saying we want it all. And just, I mean, a little bit tongue in cheek, a lot tongue in cheek. Over under. How long does it take for somebody in the Trump administration to say, we've had this great idea. Why don't we build a pipeline from Russia to Europe and export the Russian energy to Europe? We could call it Trump Stream. What do you guys think? Do you think that's a good idea?
That's awesome. Well, hey, Jacob, I just want to end by saying you had a ton of great points too. We all had great points.
Oh, we can all feel good now. We all get our participation.
I appreciate my participation trophy. Marco, you had 0 good points. I thought you were absolutely reprehensible on this podcast. Matt's the new cousin.
Well, yeah, look at there.
I'm a second cousin now.
All right, we'll talk to you later. Oh no, go ahead, Matt.
No, one happy note for everyone to think about is what you said, which is what are going to be these U.S.-Russia joint economic projects. That's going to be fun to watch.
Can I end on a note?
Like chicken factory, like chicken plucking factories.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically, there you go. I just want to, speaking of plucking poultry, I did want to say to all our listeners in the United States of America, happy Thanksgiving. I'll just share with you guys one funny anecdote. I know we got to go, but I was, I think, 13 years old when I had my first American Thanksgiving. And it was in Jordan, of all the places. And I went through the house. There was like this huge feast, and I had heard about these stories, and seen the movies. And they served turkey. And I was like, this is like the worst meat. Like nobody ever, like, what is this? Like, are we dieting? I was so disappointed. And then
you were in Jordan, though. We have to remember you were in Jordan.
No, but it's just turkey. You know what I mean? I'm like, oh, it's dry and stuff. And then when I realized the power of American entrepreneurship and ingenuity was like, wait a minute, I get to douse it in gravy and then cranberries. And that was my first taste of America right there. It's like, yes, now I get it.
Yeah.
I think everybody concedes that turkey is not great. It's all about the sides. But we should also quote Mr. Ben Franklin, who said that the turkey is in comparison a much more respectable bird to any others, and with all a true original native of America, he is, besides, though a little vain and silly, a bird of courage. So we're eating the turkeys because Ben Franklin said that's what was around and we needed to give some thanks back in the day. Of course, Thanksgiving also does not come from any of that. That's the mythology after the fact. Thanksgiving it's a Civil War